The prairie stretched wide and empty, the horizon painted with long strokes of gold and dust. To most, it was a land of promise, where fortunes could be carved out of cattle, land, and grit. But to Jonathan Hale, it was a land of endless struggle. His neighbors, those few who lived miles away, called him the poor rancher, and not out of cruelty. It was simply the truth. His herd was small, his cabin little more than rough-hewn boards holding out the wind, and his clothes patched so often that they were more stitches than fabric. Yet, despite the poverty gnawing at him, Hale was not a man who bent easily. He rose each dawn, his breath fogging in the cold morning air, and worked until nightfall. His hands were scarred, his back bent from labor, and his eyes, tired though they seemed, still carried a spark of determination. He had come west not for riches, but for freedom. Out here, a man was measured by the strength of his character, not the coins in his pocket. The rancher's life was lonely. He had no wife to share the cabin with, no children to help with the chores or lighten his burdens with laughter. His only companions were an old bay horse, Clover, and a lean cattle dog named Duke. At night, the silence of the prairie pressed down on him, broken only by the distant howl of coyotes or the restless lowing of cattle. Sometimes, as the fire in his hearth dwindled, he would wonder if anyone would remember him when his time came. Despite the hardship, Hale had a reputation. He was honest in trade, quick to lend a hand, and slow to anger. Folks in the nearest town, a day's ride away, respected him, though few truly knew him. He wasn't one to talk much, but when he did, his words carried weight. There was a kindness in him, even when it cost him more than he could spare. Once, during a particularly harsh winter, he gave up half his hay to a struggling widow whose livestock would have starved otherwise. His own cattle grew thin from it, but Hale never once complained. Still, the land seemed determined to break him. Droughts left his fields cracked and barren. Storms tore at his fences. Wolves sometimes picked off his calves, leaving him with little to show for months of toil, and yet he endured. To some, it looked like stubbornness. To Hale, it was duty. A man had to keep standing, no matter how hard the wind blew. It was on one such evening, after a long day of mending fence lines along the river, that Hale found himself pausing at the water's edge. The spring rains had swollen the river, turning it into a rushing beast, frothing and snarling as it cut through the land. He leaned against the post he had driven into the ground, sweat running down his brow, and stared into the torrent. Something about that river seemed alive, wild, untamed, dangerous, and yet oddly familiar. It was, in its own way, a mirror of his life, always pulling, always threatening to sweep him under. Yet he held fast, stubbornly fighting the current. The rancher wiped his hands on his trousers and turned back toward his cabin, unaware that fate was already shifting in the water's depths. For all his years of hardship, all the nights of loneliness and quiet struggle, the true test of his character had not yet come. The prairie was about to put him in the path of something greater than survival, something that would test not just his strength, but the very heart of who he was, and it would begin not with cattle or crops, but with the cries of two children carried away by the river. The storm had come sudden and fierce, the kind that painted the horizon black and sent the prairie grass bowing low under sheets of rain. All through the night, thunder cracked across the plains, rattling the little cabin as if the heavens themselves meant to tear it down. Jonathan Hale had lain awake, listening to the roof groan beneath the weight of water, praying the riverbanks would hold. By dawn, the storm had passed, but the damage was plain. The usually quiet stream near his land had transformed into a swollen, raging river. It snarled and frothed, as if it carried all the fury of the storm within it. Its once clear waters, now thick with mud, branches, and debris, swept from miles upstream. Fence posts were gone, ripped from the ground as if they were no sturdier than straw. Hale knew it would take days of backbreaking work to rebuild. But that wasn't what froze him as he stood near the water's edge that morning. Above the roar of the river, he heard something faint, so faint that at first he thought it was only his imagination. A cry, high-pitched, desperate. It came again, carried by the wind, and his heart clenched. He scanned the river, squinting against the spray. Then he saw it. A large log, battered and spinning in the current, was being dragged downstream like a toy. Clinging to it, two small figures, children. Their hands gripped the slick wood with a desperation that made Hale's throat tighten. One cried out again, voice nearly swallowed by the river's roar, while the other clung silently, head bowed low, as if already too weak to scream. For an instant, Hale froze. He knew what that water could do. A man could be pulled under in seconds, dashed against rocks, or dragged for miles. He had seen full-grown cattle vanish in floods like this. And yet, here were children, small, helpless, certain to be swallowed if no one acted. His heart hammered. They weren't white children from the nearest settlements. Their long black hair and clothing marked them as native. The thought struck him like a branding iron. If I save them, what then? The tribe might believe he'd harmed them. He could already picture a dozen different endings, most of them with him lying dead in the dirt. But the hesitation lasted only a breath. His better nature roared louder than the river. Whatever the consequences, those were children, and no man worth his salt could stand by while they drowned. Without another thought, Hale tore off his coat and boots, leaving them in the mud. He waded in, the cold biting like knives. The current seized him instantly, pulling at his legs, dragging him downstream. He fought forward, muscles burning, eyes fixed on the log. The children were drifting closer to the bend in the river, where jagged rocks jutted out like teeth. If they struck there, it would be the end. "Hold on!" he bellowed, though he doubted they could hear him over the thunder of water. Each stroke forward was a battle. The river slammed him against floating debris, clawed at his arms, and tried to drag him under. His lungs screamed for air. His body begged him to turn back. But he pressed on, inch by inch, until at last he reached the log. The older child looked at him with wide, terrified eyes, as if not sure whether to fear him or trust him. Hale grabbed hold of the log with one arm, nearly torn away by the current, and shouted, "I've got you! Hold tight!" The smaller child slipped, letting out a piercing scream as fingers lost their grip. Without thinking, Hale lunged, catching the child's wrist just as the river tried to claim them. Pain shot up his arm, but he held on with every ounce of strength he had left. Now came the harder part, getting to shore. The current dragged all three of them downstream like rag dolls. Hale kicked furiously, muscles screaming, aiming for a low bank ahead. Twice he thought he would lose them. Twice the water closed over his head, choking him, filling his lungs with fire. But somehow, through sheer will, he forced them closer and closer until his feet found purchase on the muddy shallows. With a final roar of effort, he dragged the children onto the bank and collapsed beside them. Gasping like a man pulled back from the grave, the river thundered past, as if mocking their survival, carrying away the log that had been their only hope moments before. The children lay beside him, coughing, trembling, but alive. Hale rolled onto his back, chest heaving, staring up at the pale sky. Relief washed over him, heavier than the river itself. He had saved them, but deep down he knew this was only the beginning, because saving them meant something else was surely coming. The three of them lay sprawled on the muddy riverbank, gasping like fish thrown onto dry land. The river thundered past, unrelenting, dragging branches and whole shrubs in its current. For a long moment, Jonathan Hale could do nothing but listen to the pounding of his own heartbeat, louder than the water itself. His chest burned with every breath, his arms trembled from exhaustion, and his legs felt as though they no longer belonged to him. Beside him, the smaller child, a boy of no more than 7, coughed up a lungful of river water, his small body racked with shivers. The older one, a girl perhaps 10 or 11, clung to her brother protectively, her black hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide and wild. She looked at Hale with something between fear and suspicion, as if uncertain whether he was a savior or a threat. Hale propped himself up on his elbows, chest heaving. He knew the look. Out here, where settlers and tribes often lived on the edge of mistrust, it was only natural. Yet he also knew children's eyes didn't lie. Behind the fear, there was gratitude, raw and unspoken, but there. "You're safe now," Hale managed to rasp, his voice rough from swallowing river water. "Safe," The boy coughed again, clutching his sister's arm. The girl pulled him close, never taking her eyes off the strange man who had pulled them from death's grasp. Hale knew they were too cold, too shaken to stay out there in the open. If the chill didn't kill them, the river would come back for them in dreams. Slowly, he forced himself to stand, his soaked clothes clinging heavy to his skin. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed past the pain. He bent and lifted the boy into his arms, steadying the girl with his other hand. "Come on now," he muttered. "We'll get you warm." It was no easy walk. The mud sucked at his boots, and every step sent jolts of pain through his tired body. The girl stumbled beside him, refusing to let go of her brother's hand, even as her small legs trembled. Hale guided them toward his cabin, a squat silhouette in the distance, smoke still curling weakly from the chimney. By the time they reached the door, his arms felt like lead. He set the boy gently on a chair near the hearth, then ushered the girl inside. Duke, the cattle dog, whined and sniffed at the children, tail wagging uncertainly. Hale waved him back. He set about building up the fire, tossing logs onto the embers until the flames crackled bright and hot. The cabin filled with warmth, and for the first time since the rescue, the children began to stop shivering. "Here," Hale said, stripping a wool blanket from his bed and wrapping it around their shoulders. "Dry off best you can." The girl clutched the blanket tightly, her eyes never leaving him. The boy leaned into her side, too weak to speak, though his trembling lips formed something faint, perhaps a thank you, though Hale couldn't be sure. Hale knelt in front of them, searching their faces. They were bruised and scraped from the river, but alive. He tore a strip from an old shirt and bound a cut on the boy's arm, careful and gentle. He had no skill in medicine, but he knew enough to clean wounds and keep them from festering. When the boy winced, Hale gave a small, reassuring nod. "You'll be all right, son. Both of you will." The girl's gaze softened slightly. She reached out a tentative hand, resting it against her brother's bandage. Hale caught a glimpse of what lay beneath her guarded expression. Trust, forming like a fragile seed. But as he rose and sat back against the hearth, letting the heat dry his own clothes, unease crept in. These weren't children from town. They were from the tribe whose hunting grounds stretched beyond the far hills. Sooner or later, their kin would come looking, and when they did, would they see him as a rescuer or a thief who had taken their children into his cabin? As the firelight danced across the walls, Hale leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The river had tried to claim him, and he had fought it. But the real storm, he suspected, was still to come. The fire crackled softly, filling the cabin with a gentle warmth that pushed back the damp chill clinging to their bones. Shadows danced across the wooden walls, and the storm outside had faded into nothing more than the occasional drip from the eaves. Inside, silence reigned, broken only by the hissing of wet clothes drying near the hearth and the ragged breathing of the children. Jonathan Hale sat across from them, elbows resting on his knees, hands dangling loosely. He studied them without speaking, not wanting to spook them further. The girl still held her brother close, her dark eyes fixed on him with the guarded sharpness of someone far older than her years. She had the look of a protector, standing between her brother and the world, even if she was only a child herself. Hale respected that. He'd seen plenty of grown men break under less pressure, but she held steady. Her little brother, though, leaned against her shoulder with the trust of the very young, his body still trembling with the aftershocks of fear and cold. "You're safe here," Hale said finally, his voice low, steady. "No harm's gonna come to you?" The girl didn't answer. She only tightened her grip on the boy, who peeked out at Hale with wide, uncertain eyes. Hale offered a faint smile, though it felt awkward on his weathered face. To give them time, he busied himself with the small chores of comfort. He ladled water from a pot into tin cups, setting one carefully in front of them. The boy hesitated, then reached for it with small, shaking hands. He drank greedily, spilling half of it down his chin, but the relief in his eyes was plain. "There now?" Hale murmured, more to himself than them. "That's better." He rummaged through a small shelf and pulled out a loaf of bread, hard, stale, but edible. He broke it into pieces and placed them on a plate, sliding it toward the children. Hunger overpowered hesitation. The boy ate quickly, crumbs sticking to his wet face. The girl, though slower, eventually followed suit, keeping her wary gaze on Hale all the while. Duke, the cattle dog, crept closer, tail wagging. The boy's hand darted down instinctively, brushing the dog's head. Duke licked his fingers, earning the faintest giggle from the child, a fragile sound, like a candle flickering in the dark. Hale's chest eased at the sound, small as it was. After a while, the girl spoke for the first time. Her voice was quiet, accented, but clear. "Why?" Hale blinked. "Why what? Why? You help us?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as if bracing for a lie. Hale rubbed his jaw, stubble rasping against his calloused fingers. The question cut deep. Why had he? Because he was a fool? Because he couldn't stand by and let children drown no matter who they were? He met her gaze. "Because you needed saving," he said simply. "Didn't matter who you were. A life's a life." The girl studied him for a long moment, then looked down at her brother. He had stopped shaking, his small hands clinging to the blanket Hale had given them. She whispered something to him in her own tongue, words Hale couldn't understand, though he recognized the tone, comfort, reassurance. When she looked back at him, something had shifted. The suspicion in her eyes hadn't vanished, but it had softened, replaced by a cautious glimmer of trust. The boy, braver now, reached into the plate for another piece of bread. "Between bites," he whispered. "Thank you." The words were halting, clumsy, but they landed in Hale's chest like a heavy stone. For a man who had lived so long with silence as his only company, those two words meant more than he cared to admit. He leaned back in his chair, letting the warmth of the fire seep into his bones. He had done what any decent man should, but still, something about this moment felt different. The prairie had always been a lonely place for him. Tonight, though, in his little cabin with two frightened children slowly warming to his presence, the silence seemed less heavy. For the first time in a long while, Hale didn't feel entirely alone, yet even as the fire burned bright, a shadow lingered in his mind. He knew this peace couldn't last. Children didn't wander far from their people. Somewhere out there, parents would be searching, and when they found them here, in a white rancher's cabin, the truth might not be enough to save him. But for tonight, Hale let the worry rest. He had 2 lives to protect, and for now that was enough. The fire burned low, its orange glow flickering across the rough-hewn cabin walls. Outside, the prairie had fallen into silence, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the grass and the lonely cry of a night bird. Within, the 2 children finally slept, curled together beneath the wool blanket, their breathing steady and soft. Jonathan Hale sat in the shadows, his chair angled so he could see both the fire and the little ones he had pulled from death's grip. His body begged for rest. His muscles ached from the battle with the river, his skin stung where the current had torn it raw, but his mind refused to quiet. He had done the right thing. He knew that as surely as he knew the stars still burned above the clouds. Yet, as he sat alone with his thoughts, the weight of what might come pressed down heavier than any floodwater. Those children belonged to someone, a family, a tribe. Somewhere out in the darkness, parents were searching, maybe praying, maybe already mourning. He could almost picture it, warriors scouring the riverbanks by torchlight, voices calling through the night, hearts breaking with each unanswered echo. And when they found him? Hale rubbed his hands over his face, sighing hard. Out here, mistrust between settlers and natives was deep as the river itself. Too many years of broken treaties. Too many graves dug because one side thought the other had taken more than was theirs. He'd heard stories, white men vanishing after straying too far into hunting grounds, native families driven off by settlers' rifles. There was little room for mercy on either side. What would they see when they arrived at his cabin? 2 frightened children in the care of a poor white rancher. Would they believe he had saved them, or would they see only danger in his face? His eyes drifted to the girl. Even in sleep, her arm was draped over her brother protectively. She looked peaceful now, but earlier her eyes had been sharp, suspicious. Would her people believe her if she told them the truth? Or would they think she'd been coached, coerced? A pit formed in Hale's stomach. He could almost feel the cold steel of spears aimed at his chest, the burn of arrows trained on him before he could utter a word in his defense. One man against a tribe, what chance did he have? He rose and paced the small cabin, the floor creaking under his boots. Duke, his dog, lifted his head and whined softly, sensing his unease. Hale gave him a pat, more to steady himself than to calm the animal. Should he ride into the night, find the children's people, and bring them back? That thought flickered through his mind, but he dismissed it quickly. If he stumbled into them in the dark, unarmed save for his word, they might not give him a chance to explain. No, better to wait. At least here he could show he had kept the children safe, fed, and warm. Still, doubt gnawed at him. He thought of the girl's question, "Why help us?" It seemed so simple, yet it carried the weight of centuries of mistrust. He had answered honestly. But would honesty mean anything at dawn? Hale stopped at the window, peering into the night. The prairie stretched endless and black, stars pricked across the sky like watchful eyes. Somewhere out there, he knew, riders would come. Maybe a few, maybe many. And when they did, everything he had ever known, the little he had left, would hang on their judgment. He returned to his chair, staring at the fire as if the flames could offer answers. The children stirred in their sleep, the boy murmuring something in his own tongue, and the girl tightened her hold protectively. Hale's chest tightened. He had saved them once from the river. Come morning, he might have to save them again, from the anger of their own people and from the vengeance that might fall on him. The night stretched long, each tick of the clock echoing like a drumbeat. Hale did not sleep. He kept watch, not only over the children, but over the shadows pressing in around the cabin, waiting for dawn to break, and with it, whatever fate the morning light would bring. The prairie was always quietest just before dawn. That thin gray hour when night reluctantly gives way to morning seemed almost holy in its stillness. Jonathan Hale sat on the porch of his cabin, shotgun resting across his knees, though he prayed he'd never have to use it. His eyes were bloodshot from a night without sleep. Inside, the two children still lay bundled beneath the blanket by the fire, finally resting soundly after their ordeal. Hale kept his gaze on the horizon. He had been listening for hours, listening for the thing he knew was coming. At first it was just a suspicion, a tightening in his gut. Then, faint and far off, it came, the dull thunder of hooves. His hands tightened on the stock of the shotgun. The sound grew louder, clearer until there was no mistaking it. Not one rider, not a handful, dozens. The earth itself began to tremble under the weight of them. The first light of morning broke over the plains as they appeared, a line of horsemen cresting the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. They came fast, fanning out as they neared, their numbers swelling until Hale could scarcely believe his eyes. 100 warriors, their painted faces grim, their weapons gleaming. Bows, lances, rifles, enough to flatten his ranch a dozen times over. Hale rose slowly, setting the shotgun aside. He knew well enough that one man against 100 was no fight at all. If he raised that gun, he'd be dead before he could chamber a second round. Better to stand unarmed, to meet them eye to eye. The warriors spread into a wide circle around his cabin, the thunder of hooves settling into an ominous silence. Dust swirled in the cool morning air. The horses snorted, stamping nervously, their riders steady as stone. At their head rode a man who could only be the chief. He was broad-shouldered, his hair bound with feathers, his chest bare but for a beaded necklace that glinted in the dawn. His expression was carved from iron, his gaze sharp enough to cut. He dismounted with deliberate slowness, the ground seeming to tremble beneath his boots. Behind him, the warriors tightened their circle. The air was thick, heavy, charged with the promise of violence. Hale raised his hands slightly, palms open. His voice came out steady, though his heart hammered in his chest. They're inside, alive, safe. The chief's eyes narrowed. His voice was deep, cold. You speak of my children. Hale swallowed hard, nodding once. Pulled 'em from the river yester evening. Nearly drowned. I brought 'em here, warmed 'em, fed 'em, nothing more. A murmur rippled through the circle of warriors, low and dangerous, like the growl of wolves. The chief's gaze flicked toward the cabin, then back to Hale. If they are harmed, they're not, Hale cut in, his voice firmer now. I'd never harm a child. Yours or anyone's. The chief's hand tightened around the haft of his spear. The tension was unbearable, the kind that prickled Hale's skin and made every breath feel like glass in his lungs. Duke growled softly from inside the cabin, sensing the danger. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the cabin door creaked. The girl stepped into the dawn light, her brother clutching her hand. Their small figures looked impossibly fragile against the sea of warriors. 100 eyes turned to them. The boy blinked at the sight of his father, and a smile broke across his weary face. He cried out in their language, tugging his sister forward. The girl hesitated, but then her eyes found the chief's. For the first time, her guarded expression cracked. Relief, raw and unhidden, flooded her face. The chief's jaw tightened, but his stance did not soften. He waited, silent, as his children hurried toward him. Every heartbeat felt like a hammer striking stone. Hale stood where he was, hands still raised, knowing that the next few breaths would decide whether he lived or whether the prairie would claim another grave by sunrise. The sun had climbed just enough to spill pale gold across the prairie, yet the morning felt colder than any night. 100 warriors sat mounted in a tightening circle, their faces painted in sharp colors, eyes locked on the lone figure of Jonathan Hale. In their midst, the children had broken free of fear, rushing into the arms of the towering man at the front, their father, the chief. The reunion lasted only a heartbeat before the chief's face hardened again. He turned his gaze back toward Hale, and the air seemed to crack with tension. You, the chief said, his voice deep and rolling like distant thunder. His English was thickly accented, but clear enough. You took my children. Hale's jaw tightened. He kept his voice steady, calm. I didn't take them. I pulled them out of the river. They were drowning. You'd be digging graves this morning if I'd turned my back. The warriors around the circle shifted in their saddles, gripping spears, rifles, and bows. Their horses snorted and pawed the earth, the restless energy of 100 men ready for war pressing down like a weight. The chief's eyes narrowed, unreadable. Why would a white rancher risk his life for the children of his enemy? Hale bristled at the word. Enemy? I never asked for that fight. All I saw were 2 children in trouble. Didn't matter whose they were. The chief stepped closer, his shadow falling across Hale. He was a head taller, broad as an oak, and every line in his weathered face spoke of authority, of battles fought and survived. Men do not risk death for nothing. You want something. What is it? Hale met his gaze squarely. What I wanted was for them to live. That's all. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind had stilled. The children clung to their father's sides, their eyes darting between the 2 men. The boy tugged at his father's arm, speaking quickly in their own tongue. Pointing back at Hale, the girl joined in, her words urgent, her small hands gesturing to mimic the river, then clutching her brother's wrist as if to reenact how Hale had grabbed hold and saved him. The chief listened, his face a mask of stone. His children's voices were high, pleading, raw with truth. Yet around them, the circle of warriors remained tight, their distrust as thick as the dust in the morning air. Finally, the chief raised a hand, silencing the murmurs of his warriors. He looked back at Hale, his voice sharp. If your words are true, then your heart is strong. But my people have seen too many lies from your kind, too many stolen children, too many graves dug. Why should I believe this is different? Hale spread his hands wider, empty and open. Because you can see it in their faces. Ask them, look at them. They're alive because I chose to risk my life. If you still want my blood, then take it, but don't call me a liar. The last words rang out across the circle like a shot. A murmur rippled through the warriors, some surprised, some angered, some thoughtful. The chief studied him in silence. His children pressed close to his legs, repeating their pleas, pointing again and again at Hale. The boy even stepped forward, tugging at his father's hand, then motioned toward the cabin as if to show proof of warmth and food. For a long, excruciating moment, it seemed the chief might raise his hand and give the order that would end Hale's life in a storm of arrows and steel. Hale's pulse thundered in his ears, but he did not look away. He stood tall, his weathered face steady, his hands still raised, as if daring the prairie itself to judge his truth. And then, quietly, almost reluctantly, the chief lowered his spear. The circle of warriors stilled, waiting for their leader's word. The chief's gaze flicked once more to Hale, searching his face for deceit, then to his children, whose eyes shone with fierce conviction. "Your life is borrowed by their words," the chief said at last. "If they speak true, you are a friend. If not," his eyes darkened, "you will answer with your blood." The tension did not vanish. It shifted, coiled like a rattlesnake ready to strike, but for now, Hale still drew breath. And in the chief's measured restraint, in the children's desperate pleas, a fragile thread of possibility hung in the morning air. The prairie wind returned. Soft at first, tugging at the feathers and beads woven into the warriors' hair, rattling the leather straps that bound their weapons. It was as though the land itself had waited to exhale, yet in the circle of warriors, silence reigned. The chief's pronouncement that Hale's life balanced on the testimony of his children hung heavy. The boy, no more than 8, stepped forward. His small chest rose and fell quickly, but his eyes held the stubborn fire of his father's bloodline. He spoke in his own tongue, his words tumbling with urgency. He lifted his hands and pointed toward the river, sweeping them downward to mimic the motion of falling into the current. Then he slapped his chest hard, clutching as though water filled his lungs. He paused, looked at his father, then turned and pointed squarely at Hale. The circle of warriors murmured. Some frowned. Some leaned forward, curious. The boy's gestures became wilder. He stomped his feet, made a grabbing motion, then threw his arms wide, sucking in a loud, exaggerated breath. His voice cracked as he shouted one final word, one that needed no translation. "Saved!" The girl, a little younger, stepped forward next. Her long braids swung as she nodded furiously. Tears streaked her face, but they were not tears of fear, they were of desperation. She clutched her brother's arm, reenacting his slip into the river, then seized Hale's invisible hand out of the air and yanked hard, as though dragging him back to safety. Then she turned, looking up at her father, her tiny fists pounding her own chest. "She says you owe him." One of the warriors muttered in their language, translating for those too far to hear. "She says his hands are the reason their hearts still beat." The chief's expression remained unreadable, but his children were relentless. They crowded him, tugging at his hands, his clothes, his belt, their voices rising together in a chorus of frantic pleas. Hale felt a lump catch in his throat. He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. Their little hands trembled as they gestured toward him, their eyes shining with truth. The children had no cause to lie. Their innocence was unclouded by politics, by distrust, by the centuries of blood that lay between their people and his. And still, the chief hesitated. His jaw was tight, his dark eyes searching the faces of his warriors. Some nodded grimly, convinced of Hale's honesty. Others scowled, unwilling to soften. A man to the chief's right growled in their tongue, "White men do not save our children. They take them." The chief's gaze flicked sharply toward the man, silencing him with nothing more than a look. Then the boy did something no one expected. He turned away from his father and strode straight across the circle to Hale. His small hand, still damp and rough from the river, reached for the rancher's calloused palm. Without hesitation, he gripped it tight. The gasp that rippled through the warriors was like a sudden gust of wind. The girl followed, pressing herself to Hale's side, her small arms circling his leg. Both children clung to him, their fragile bodies trembling but resolute. Hale froze, his chest heavy with the weight of their trust. He looked at the chief, meeting his eyes not with challenge this time, but with something far stronger, humility. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The children's gesture spoke louder than words ever could. For a long moment, the prairie held its breath again. The circle of warriors stirred uneasily, waiting. Some shifted, some whispered. But none dared break the silence until the chief himself moved. He walked forward slowly, every step deliberate. His shadow fell across Hale and the children. The boy straightened, but did not let go of Hale's hand. The girl tightened her grip. The chief stopped before them, towering. His broad hand reached down, not for a weapon, but for his son's shoulder. He looked from his children to the weathered rancher who had risked everything. Finally, his voice rumbled, low but clear. My children say your hands pulled them from death. For that, my tribe owes you a debt. A warrior repays honor with honor. He extended his arm toward Hale, not as a threat but as a gesture of recognition. The circle broke in murmurs. The 100 warriors who had come ready to kill now sat in uneasy silence, forced to reckon with the sight of their chief lowering his guard before a poor rancher. And just like that, the dawn carried with it the first fragile thread of peace. The morning sun was climbing higher, warming the prairie and melting the last of the dawn's chill. Yet the circle of warriors still felt like ice around Jonathan Hale. He hadn't moved since the chief's words. The children clung to him as if they feared their father might change his mind in an instant, and in truth, Hale wasn't sure that fear was misplaced. The chief's arm remained extended, steady as stone. Slowly, Hale shifted his hand from the boy's grip and clasped the chief's forearm. Their grips locked, strong and unyielding. For a moment, the silence around them seemed absolute, broken only by the wind rustling the grass. When their hands fell away, the chief spoke again. I am Chief Iron Bear. These are my people. You saved my children, and for that you are owed a life debt. But do not mistake this for trust. His gaze was sharp as a blade. A debt can be repaid. Trust must be earned. Hale gave a small nod. Fair enough. I don't ask for your trust, only for the truth of what happened to be enough. I didn't think about tribes or land or blood when I saw those kids in the water. I just thought about saving them. The warriors stirred, some muttering under their breath. Iron Bear lifted a hand and silenced them without looking away from Hale. Many of your kind speak honeyed words, but their hands drip with blood. Tell me, rancher, why should I believe you are different? Hale's throat tightened, but he forced himself to answer plainly. Because I've buried enough to know the weight of loss. I don't want more graves on this land. Not for me. Not for you. Not for your children. He paused, his weathered face softening. I live alone. No family left. When I saw your boy go under, I thought of what it would mean if he didn't come back up. I couldn't let that happen. The chief's eyes flickered. Something subtle, a faint shift like storm clouds thinning. Still, his voice stayed hard. Our people remember every raid, every broken promise. My warriors have seen their mothers and children fall to white men's guns. When they rode here at dawn, they came ready to take your scalp as payment for years of sorrow. Only these children held them back. The boy, still standing close to Hale, lifted his chin defiantly as if to say he'd stand by that choice no matter the cost. The girl clung tighter to Hale's leg, unafraid even under the weight of her father's stern words. Hale glanced around the circle, then back to the chief. I can't answer for what other men have done. I can't erase your people's grief. All I can do is tell you that when I had a choice, to walk away or to risk myself, I chose the harder thing. If you think that counts for nothing, then I guess you'll do what you have to do. A ripple went through the warriors at his bluntness. Some glared at him with open hostility. Others, though, looked unsettled, as though his words gnawed at something deep inside. Chief Iron Bear studied Hale long and hard. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, then finally he said, You speak plain. That I respect. My people have no use for pretty lies. Perhaps you are not like the others. Perhaps. He turned his head slightly, addressing the circle. This man saved what was most precious to me. His deed is his shield. No blade will touch him today. The tension broke like a taut rope snapping. A low rumble of voices moved through the warriors, some angry, some approving, most uncertain. But none dared challenge their chief's decree. Iron Bear looked back at Hale one last time. You live, rancher. Not because you are trusted, not because you are welcome. You live because my children's breath is proof of your hands. Remember this. Respect is a fragile thing, easily broken. Do not betray it. Hale dipped his head. I won't. For the first time, something almost like acknowledgement glimmered in the chief's eyes. Not warmth, not yet, but the faintest ember of respect, waiting to see if it might grow. The prairie, once so heavy with the threat of bloodshed, began to breathe again. The circle of warriors loosened, though they kept their distance, their faces still sharp with suspicion. The chief's children had not left Hale's side, their small hands gripping him as if they knew that fragile peace depended on their presence. Chief Iron Bear stood tall, his gaze sweeping across his warriors before settling once more on the poor rancher. "This day is not forgotten," he said, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. "My children live because of you. The spirits saw it, and so did my people. For that, your name will not be spoken with hate among us. For now." The boy beamed with pride at his father's words, and the girl leaned closer to Hale, her tiny hand squeezing his rough palm. Hale looked down at her, something unspoken catching in his chest. He had saved them for no reward, yet here, under the golden sweep of morning, he realized the act had changed more than their lives. It had changed his own. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse but steady. "Chief Iron Bear, I don't ask for friendship, but maybe we don't have to live as enemies. This land's wide enough for both of us if we let it be." The chief tilted his head, studying him. "Words like those are easy to speak. Harder to live, I know," Hale admitted. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the sun painted the land in light. "But if a man can save a child not his own, maybe there's a chance we can stop drowning each other too." For the first time, the chief's stern face softened. Barely, but enough to be seen. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then gestured for his daughter to return to him. The children hesitated, glancing back at Hale with eyes full of gratitude, before moving to their father's side. The girl looked up at the chief and spoke quickly, her words tumbling over one another. A warrior nearby translated in a hushed voice. "She says you must not forget. She says the rancher has a brave heart, like the warriors of our people." Iron Bear's lips pressed into a line, but there was pride in his eyes as he lifted her into his arms. "Out of the mouths of children comes the truth," he said. His gaze locked on Hale again. "Perhaps today is a beginning. But remember, rancher, peace is not made in a single morning. It must be carried, guarded, like fire against the wind." Hale gave a firm nod. "Then I'll carry it as far as I can." The chief raised his arm, and with that signal, the warriors began to pull away, their circle breaking apart like a tide receding. Hooves pounded the earth as they wheeled their horses toward the open prairie. Dust rose in their wake, glowing like smoke in the morning sun. Iron Bear lingered only a moment longer. His children clung to him, but their eyes never left Hale, their faces bright with something more powerful than gratitude, hope. The chief inclined his head in a gesture of respect, a gesture few white men had ever earned. Then, without another word, he turned his horse and rode after his people, the children safe at his side. When the thunder of hooves finally faded, Hale stood alone again. The cabin loomed quiet behind him, the river's murmur drifting on the breeze. For the first time in years, he didn't feel entirely alone. Something had shifted in the soil of his life, something planted in the space between two children's laughter and a father's reluctant respect. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. He was still a poor rancher, still a man without kin, still scraping a living from a land that gave little and took much. But now, as the sun climbed higher, he felt as though he had been given something worth more than wealth or cattle, the chance, however fragile, to turn enemies into something closer to neighbors. And though he could not know what tomorrow would bring, Jonathan Hale knew this. When the river tried to claim 2 lives, it had unknowingly delivered a chance for peace. And at dawn, with 100 warriors watching, a poor rancher had proven that even the smallest act of courage could ripple outward, changing the course of lives far beyond his own.